Thanks for that, Tom, and glad to be here. I'm talking today about what people call voice in I'm talking about two formal syntactic approaches to what people call voice in Philippine and Formosan languages. And I really probably don't need to introduce voice to you guys. You've heard a lot about it already, but there are a couple things I want to draw your attention to. What we mean by the voice system in these languages is that affixes on the verb give us some indication as to which argument in the argument structure has nominative case. That's what they mean by voice. And we have in Philippine languages, so Tagalog are the examples in one here. In the actor voice in 1A, we have nominative case on the subject. I'm going to be referring to subjects and direct objects. Not going to call all the nominative subjects. We have what we call patient voice in B and C, and nominative case on the direct object. There are two different patient voice markings. The suffix in indicates a prospective event, and the infix in gives us a perfective event. And note that the infix also shows up on the other, what we call non-actor voice clause types. There are two applicative constructions, in other words. So D is the locative applicative, the locative voice with nominative case on a location, and E gives us what people call the circumstantial voice. And in this case, this voice is associated with a constellation of arguments that I'll have more to say about later, and nominative case on, in this case, a beneficiary. Now, the challenge, of course, is how to account for this in syntax and formally. So a popular approach is to treat the voice marking as some kind of agreement with the argument that is marked with the nominative case. And this most generally is with the case feature of the, can we see both of these? With the case feature of the argument. According to the case agreements analysis, what I've just called nominative case and what's glossed as genitive case are not case markers at all. They're just indicating which argument underwent agreement, whether it was the subject with nominative case or the direct object with accusative case. All right. I'm going to be arguing against this approach and in favor of a direct approach. A direct approach which takes this Philippine type alignment at face value. And since I mentioned the word alignment in Philippine and Formosan languages is a bit of a controversial subject. One thing that is not controversial is the fact that non-actor voice clauses starting with B going to E are ergative clauses. Everybody knows this. We have a nominative internal argument, that's the absolutive, and a non-nominative external argument, that's the ergative. The non-nominative or the external argument is genitive case in these languages. The controversy surrounds actor voice. I'm not going to get into this controversy today. I'm simply going to say that some of these languages are ergative and have an antipassive. So the actor voice is intransitive like it is in Tagalog. Tagalog is an ergative language, but not all languages in this region are fully ergative. So the antipassive, they don't have an antipassive. The actor voice is transitive. Another way to, so these are split ergative languages. And another way to refer to the split ergative languages is what some people call symmetrical voice. So I'm agreeing with the previous talk that symmetrical voice is actually a type of split ergativity. So we have multiple transitive clause types. That's split ergativity. All right. Final thing that I'm going to talk about before moving on is the extraction restriction. You've seen this today already as well. When A-bar movement takes place, it's typically only the nominative or the agreeing DP that undergoes movement. So in patient voice clauses, the direct object becomes the head of a relative clause, like in 4. In AB actor voice clauses, it's the subject that moves. So I'm arguing against the agreement approach in favor of the direct approach, so we will move on now to these two approaches. So for illustration, all of the arguments I have here apply to all of the agreement approaches that I'm aware of, but I'm for illustration using Andrea Rakowski's dissertation. So her basic starting assumption is that nominative and accusative cases are assigned nominative by T, accusative by a little b, just like in English. And the Then the voice morphology is a type of agreement with the case feature of the nominal that is closest to T structurally. So in a patient voice clause, you have to move the object so that it's close to T, closer than the subject. And the mechanism for that, Rakowski builds on the information structural asymmetry between patient voice and actor voice. Then the patient voice, the direct object is typically definite, at least specific. So it has a presuppositional interpretation. In order to get that interpretation, it has to move to the edge of the little VP phase. In that position, in 6b here, it's the closest argument to T. So then it can pass its case feature, which, since this is a direct object, is accusative, passes that case feature to T, and the verb will move up to T, and then patient voice morphology will be spelled out, because it's patient voice morphology is agreement with accusative case. In the actor voice clause, the direct object is in Tagalog always indefinite and typically non-specific. So the object does not undergo movement. That leaves the subject as the highest argument in the little VP. So the subject will pass its nominative case feature to T, which will be spelled out as actor voice morphology. Then for the extraction restriction, the highest DP in the little VP phase edge, the one that triggers agreement, is the one that will undergo further movement. Now, first off, there are a number of conceptual problems with this approach. The first conceptual problem is that there's no direct morphological evidence that the nominative and accusative case features are being assigned, since these do not line up with the markers on the nominals themselves. That's one thing. Another thing is there's no morphological evidence that the agreement is taking place. So I think that this system is actually not acquirable by little kids. The second conceptual problem is that it involves a complication. It involves not just licensing or case assignment, but also agreement with the case feature. Third conceptual problem is, well, the voice markers themselves don't look like agreement. First of all, the perfective infix in shows up not only on patient voice verbs, but also on the two obligative verbs. So it's the only voice marker in patient voice, but you can't treat it as a patient voice marker because it shows up in other voices as well. And the other voice affixes, they're distributed all over the verb. So we don't have a single slot for a case agreement. We got a prefix sometimes, an infix sometimes, and suffix sometimes. And the fourth conceptual problem is this is just a weird way to envision agreement. For instance, in the actor voice, T assigns nominative case to the subject, and then it turns around and says, now I need that right back again. That's just weird. Now, the direct approach, since I've already told you these are either ergative or split ergative languages, the two main cases that we have to be concerned with are the genitive case on the subject and the nominative case on an internal argument in these ergative clauses. Both of these cases are licensed in the higher phase, so by C/T. We do not have nominative in the higher phase and accusative in the lower phase, because these languages are not nominative accusative alignment. So both of the case features that we're interested in come from the higher phase head. In the AV, there's only one case feature, which is the nominative. And the nominative is going to be assigned by the CT amalgamated head to the subject. Then I assume a C to T inheritance approach to minimalist syntax, but C and T do not necessarily split. They only split if they license separate constituents, but not if only one constituent is licensed. So in this case, there's only one case, only the subject is licensed, so C and T do not split. The actor voice morphology is spelled out on the amalgamated CT head. Now, in the non-actor voice, so these are the transitive ergative clauses, we have two cases. We have the genitive for the subject and nominative for the absolutive. So both of these cases are going to enter on the CT head. The subject will be licensed first since it's the higher of the two arguments. Genitive case is assigned to the subject. C, the T will split off from C, and the C will give nominative case to the object. And the non-actor voice morphology, the infix, will be spelled out on an independent T that's split off from C. So we have an explanation for this, for the actor voice and the non-actor voice in. This is also a less complex derivation because it doesn't have that extra step of agreement. And the verbal affixes are given actual functions in the syntax, and they have syntactic functions. So they are actually analyzed as heads on the clausal spine. They have very important roles to play syntactically and to a certain extent also semantic. So we have two applicatives heading applicative projections, and then the PV in suffix has both a voice role and also an aspectual role. And so I merge it as the head of the inner aspect projection within the little VP, where it selects the direct object. And there are numerous advantages to this analysis, which I'll get to as we go further on. And then since the direct approach is basically how children are going to acquire these languages, so we don't have an acquisition problem. All right, so now we're moving on to empirical issues with the case agreement analysis. So first and foremost, we don't necessarily have a one-to-one relationship between the voice affixes and case or thematic relations. So one is we have an overlap between PV marking and LV marking. In other words, PV and LV can both show up in basic transitive clauses. In other words, PV clauses where the theme or patient has nominative case. One of these environments is in languages where the locative voice marker functions as a nominalizer. And historically, so Proto-Austronesian actually, it is often assumed that Proto-Austronesian had a voice system, but that's not, the evidence doesn't point in that direction. The evidence points in the direction that Proto-Austronesian was actually an accusative language and did not have a voice system. So these voice markers had other functions in Pan to the extent that they existed. And the LV marker on did have a function. It existed in Pan and it was a nominalizer. And this nominalizing function is retained in some Formosan languages. So PV marking in verbal clauses in Kanakanavu is with un, which is the PV marker. It's cognate with in Tagalog. But in relative clauses, it's on. So if you want to view the case agreement analysis would view on as agreement with a dative case feature, but the extracted element here is the direct object. Shouldn't have dative case. Then the Amis examples are the same. And another thing here, this has come up a few times today. Tom Payne gave some examples like this from Warai this morning, in fact. So both the PV and LV marking can show up in PV clauses when there is an aspectual difference, a difference in terms of boundedness of the event. So the PV in 12A here correlates with bounded events with affected objects, but the LV marking in B correlates with a partitive event and a less affected object. But note that both of these objects are themes and presumably are getting accusative case. So this is yet a problem for the case agreements analysis. The Atayal language examples are the same here. And yet another of these lack of one-to-one correspondence. In a lot of Formosan languages in negated clauses, we have what appears on the surface to be a syncretism between LV and PV marking in negated clauses. So the LV marker shows up in PV clauses when they're negated. So this is a challenge for the agreement analysis too, because you have the LV marker shows up with both accusative objects and with dative things. So, but this is not a problem for my analysis because the PV marker is also, it is the head of the inner aspect and marks telic events with affected objects. But negated events are homogeneous and therefore unbounded. So they resist this kind of telic marking by PV. All right, now the next empirical problem has to do with the circumstantial voice. Um, so part of the one of the among the constellation of arguments, they form a natural class. The arguments that are selected by the circumstantial applicative. So we have transported themes, we have instruments, we have reasons or causes, and we have beneficiaries. This morning, I think Tom mentioned this and said something that's very close to the source that I follow, which is Jonathan Gore's dissertation, that these are all part of the initiation of the event. So a beneficiary is like a cause or a reason to initiate the event. So these arguments all fit into a natural class. And all languages that have this type, cross-linguistically, not Austronesian, all languages cross-linguistically that have this kind of applicative or like verb construction use this constellation of arguments. And the marker itself, the E prefix, historically comes from a verb meaning to wear, to have, to carry, which is also the historical source for this type of applicative in other languages that have this type of applicative. So if you analyze this E as an applicative, it makes all the sense in the world that it selects a transported theme. But from a case agreement standpoint, why would a theme be triggering this kind of agreement rather than PV marking, which is accusative agreement? All right. Another thing is that the PV affix sometimes adds semantic information like intention. So in these Amis examples, actor voice is compatible with an inanimate subject, agent. The patient voice is compatible with an animate human agent, but not with an inanimate agent. So again, the case agreement analysis would be concerned only with the case feature, the accusative case feature of the direct object, but would have nothing to say about the agent. But for me, this is not an issue because it's clear that Amis has undergone some grammaticalization already and has some changes made to it. So what I would say is that the PV marker is still base merged in the aspect head, but it can move the little v together with the verb, where together they select the external argument. So that's not surprising. And in relation to that, the PV sometimes can introduce its own argument, so it can attach to an intransitive verb and make that intransitive verb into a transitive construction. So this is completely expected on my analysis because the PV marker selects the argument itself, it selects the direct object in the inner aspect projection. But for the case agreements analysis, the PV is just a decoration. It's just reflecting the case feature of the direct object that's undergone agreement with T. But that happens later in the derivation. The spell out of the PV marking happens only post-syntactically. The PV is not present in the derivation itself. So all you have is an intransitive verb. So we don't expect there to be any accusative case to trigger this PV agreement anyway. And I'm going to skip over the fifth empirical question. It's not as interesting. We can look at it again later if you're interested. You have it on handout. And skip down to the last empirical problem, which has to do with extraction. So I said earlier in the paper that typically, as we know about what people call Philippine type languages, that when agar extraction takes place, it's usually the nominative TP that undergoes movement. However, in Tagalog, these are Tagalog examples. Exceptionally, the genitive agent can undergo movement and strand the nominative object in the clause, and that's what's happening in B. We have the declarative clause in A, this pinasanang sundalo ang anak, and then here we're extracting the sundalo, the agent, and leaving anak inside the clause. So for the agreement people, since this is a PV clause, yes, it's a PV clause. What happens, so in terms of the case agreement analysis, the object will move up to the outer specifier little b, where it will pass its accusative case feature to T. So that's how that's how you get the morphology. But now the object is the highest DP in the structure. It should be the one to undergo movement, because they take a very strict view of locality. But this is there's no locality issue from my analysis. The reason is because C/T, the phase head, it supplies both the genitive and the nominative case. So all we have to say is that exceptionally sometimes genitive case can be assigned to the subject before C and T split. And then the genitive can move up to the specifier of the CT head. And then C and T can split later, give nominative case to the object, stranding it in place. So I won't read the summary, I'll just leave it here for you, and my time is up, so that's it. Thank you.